Well, our reporter Charlie Peters is on the ground in Tel Aviv and joins us live now. Do give us an update on what's going on there.
So, in the last few moments, the IDF has announced that it is opening a new safe humanitarian corridor between 10 a.m. local time and 1 p.m. So a new 3-hour window for people in the Gaza Strip to head south of the Wadi Gaza. This comes just over 48 hours after they first, through UN liaison officers, called on everyone in the north to leave ahead of that imminent invasion. This is now the second extension they've given to that order, I think clearly recognising that the number of people heading south is not sufficient for them to launch that ground operation. Last night, the IDF's chief spokesperson on the military situation said that hundreds of thousands had fled, but would not give us a clear number on how many were remaining and how many had reached the Wadi Gaza. This also comes at a time when reports of destruction of convoys, some 70 dead in a convoy that exploded yesterday morning coming through, and also another explosion killing around a dozen yesterday on one of those corridors heading south. We can't verify who conducted those strikes, and in the last moments, the IDF said that it was not responsible for the 70 dead that Hamas claimed was the cause of an Israeli airstrike. But a very tense humanitarian situation in Gaza as that imminent invasion grows, and also as insufficient numbers head south. The UN says the situation there is untenable. And we've also heard from one of the main hospitals in North Gaza saying that they fear that they could be bombed in any upcoming invasion, because we know that the IDF is keen to use more severe munitions on the ground. They want to be using the bunker buster munitions that they deploy to remove Hamas from those subterranean tunnels where they take shelter, where they prepare attacks, and where they could launch surprise attacks on any IDF invading force.
Charlie, what do we know about the humanitarian corridors? I mean, are they passing through Israeli territory? Or, because the concern seems to be, the issue seems to be that Hamas is actually blocking Palestinian civilians from heading south.
Yes, information coming out of Gaza is fraught with propaganda and uncertainty, both sides claiming that the other is either killing or preventing the movement of internally displaced people in the Gaza Strip. The reports of blockades released from satellite imagery have yet to be verified, but the IDF is claiming that that is what is going on. Last night, the spokesperson said that they had blocked one of the two main supply routes. There are just two supply routes heading south from North Gaza. But at the same time, there have been those reports of explosions, and people who specialise in verifying this information this morning claiming that one of the explosions on one of the convoys that was destroyed yesterday could have come from a gas canister on the truck. We saw in a slowed down version of the video this morning that there was no incoming projectile hitting the truck. And so the situation on the ground extremely unclear, but demonstrably extremely dangerous. People are suffering to a grave extent, and it's not clear how many of the 1.1 million they want to flee south have fled south. But the IDF has said in these safe corridors that they're extending this morning that they just won't conduct any operational targeting within that stretch along those two routes, so that even if there are reports of Hamas military capabilities gathering in those areas, they will not target them. And we do know that Hamas like to blend in with the civilian population. They rely on civilians as human shields to conduct their assaults on Israeli territory, and also to prevent them being struck after they launch rocket attacks into the region. So a very murky, very dangerous situation for civilians as they move south.
Yeah, what do we know of the geography for them as they move south? I mean, most of Gaza's roads are very long and flat, but of course by now they're covered in rubble, so it'll be very difficult for certain sort of vehicles to get through. And when they get to Wadi Gaza, I mean, most of us understand that it's a waterway, isn't it? So, I mean, is there just one bridge crossing it to safety, or what? Do we know?
So one of those explosions yesterday reported was on one of those bridges. So yes, definitely obstacles preventing that crossing there and limiting the freedom of manoeuvre for civilians as they move down. But also many people just don't have the capability to get into vehicles or convoys of any sort. One of the reasons why that convoy of 70 that Hamas said was killed, that was destroyed in an Israeli airstrike yesterday, was moving south was because civilians are just taking any opportunity they can to get out of Gaza. We've seen photos over the last 48 hours of people fleeing just on their feet, just taking all of their possessions on their backs. People stuffing their basic supplies, their clothing, everything they might need in a refugee camp, just in bin bags, as doing everything they can to get out of North Gaza ahead of what the IDF describes as a battle zone. That is what they are going to turn North Gaza into. But those supply routes, the two of them, certainly fraught with danger, even as the Israeli Defense Forces describe them as humanitarian corridors, because, of course, it is in the Hamas tactics and their procedures to use civilians as part of their war effort, and so blockades are likely, as is the blending in of Hamas military targets within those civilian corridors heading south.
The rhetoric, Charlie, from Israel has been extremely strong, understandably so. But there's going to be pressure growing, as there always is, but perhaps more so in this case, as to what is going to be a proportionate response from Israel.
Yes, and every single press briefing that we are attending, the IDF are reminding us of what happened last Saturday. Excuse me. They are reminding reporters of the violence, the depravity, as they say, the ISIS-style butchery that took place in the kibbutzim in the south of Israel, and saying that there is only one proportionate response to this kind of terrorist violence, with 1,500 people killed in the south of Israel, and that is the total destruction of Hamas military capabilities. But there is growing global and particularly Western concern that as the IDF moves into that next offensive phase, as it seeks to destroy those Hamas military capabilities, that it will be doing so while hundreds of thousands of civilians remain. I think it's really important to remember that the IDF cannot confirm how many civilians remain in the north. They will not put a number on it. They just say hundreds of thousands have fled, but there are expected to be 1.1 million people there as late as just 2 days ago. Hospitals are still full. People are still taking shelter in North Gaza. And while just a few dozen attacks occurred on the Gaza Strip last night, that is an indicator that more is coming, the quiet before the storm. So it's highly likely that more severe munitions and the most severe bombing campaign that we've seen since this war started will be coming up in the coming days.
And meanwhile, I guess as most Israelis are completely concerned with what is presently happening, are there any questions that anyone is putting politically maybe or militarily to the government about why this was allowed to happen in the first place, about why Israeli intelligence wasn't better than they were and didn't see anything coming?
Yes, well, 4 days ago, Lieutenant General Herzi Hargevi, the IDF's chief of staff, conceded that there had been a grave intelligence and security failure. It was the first time that the IDF conceded that failure. And there have also started to be protests here in Tel Aviv against the government's handling of the situation. Last night, a few hundred gathering outside the Ministry of Defence here to protest against Benjamin Netanyahu's government and its handling of the situation. He poses himself as Mr. Security, but of course, that personal branding has taken a significant dampening since Saturday. But they're also protesting against the way that the government has handled the hostage situation. As we know, over 100 people held in the Gaza Strip, and Israelis desperately want answers on how the government and the military are going to retract them. As it stands, the IDF are offering very limited information on the strategy to achieve that, but they do say it is a top priority.
There's always got to be, in war, a long-term strategy, or at least there always should be. It's often forgotten. Sometimes they call it an exit strategy, don't they, in some conflicts. With this situation, there's got to be a question, hasn't there? Even if they got everyone out of the north of the Gaza Strip and then went in, it's what do those civilians go back to? And that's going to be a significant problem, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely, and I think that's also part of the reason why we did not see the Rafah crossing opening between the south of Gaza and Egypt yesterday, as it's understood that Egypt does not want Palestinians to leave the territory because once they're out, they fear they'll never return. There are concerns that Israel will now, after grave destruction of the Gaza Strip, possibly limit the return of civilians for many, many months. And also this concern comes on what the future of the war will be like, as there is a raised threat from the north. Last night we saw a return of rocket and artillery fire across from Syria, the first indirect fire for some 72 hours, but also a surge in activity from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon as anti-tank guided missiles and rockets were fired onto IDF positions in the north. Israel has sent hundreds of thousands of reservists north, as last night in Qatar, the head of Hamas, its political leader, met with Iran's foreign minister in a very public show of support between the Iranian regime and Hamas, as it's likely that Iranian proxies will step up their efforts to support the attacks on Israel at this very grave existential threat to the nation.
And meanwhile, before we leave you, Charlie, then, just to up sum, you said that the IDF had just told you that they would extend a sort of humanitarian corridor window, if you like, for some 3 hours, but that's all.
That's it, just 3 hours, 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. The clock is ticking. 10 minutes of that have already passed, and people will have to react very suddenly to keep moving south. I imagine that they have launched this new statement on the humanitarian corridor, released in Arabic, because people will be starting that journey and then reconsidering amid blockades and reports of death and destruction on the road south. They need to do all they can to enforce people moving south before they launch that next operation. And I think it does show some degree of restraint by the IDF. They know that they cannot strike North Gaza while so many civilians remain, because international support for their operation will dwindle extremely rapidly.
OK, Charlie, thanks very much indeed. We'll speak to you later on.